Hi, I'm Zach Horn. Today I'm going to be talking about a new obstacle to vaccine uptake. In this talk, I'm going to discuss emerging trends and attitudes towards vaccination, especially in the shadow of the pandemic. Now, this won't be an empirical talk. Rather, it's going to be a synthesis of what I think of are core problems facing researchers attempting to increase vaccine uptake. I'll begin the talk by briefly noting challenges facing public health experts who aim to correct misconceptions about vaccines in 2019. In 2019, vaccine skepticism presented a significant public health problem across the globe. A global survey in 2018 found that approximately 13% of people believed that vaccines are unsafe, leading to over 40,000 cases of measles in Europe. Unfortunately, a number of researchers have found that efforts to debunk this and assure people of the safety of vaccines often can fail and may even backfire. And even if these misconceptions seem fringe, they had substantial consequences. In Samoa in 2019, 53 people, most of whom were children, died of measles from being unvaccinated. These obstacles prompted some of my research by my colleagues and I into how vaccines are presented in the news media. In particular, we are interested in examining how presentation of information in news feeds impacts perceptions of the dangers of vaccines. Now, unfortunately, hundreds of people have died from the flu in late 2019. And if you Google it, one thing that was really striking is even though the articles were often about the dangers of the flu at the time, the images typically presented with this information were pictures of flu shots. Now let's think about this, because typically if there were a salmonella outbreak in chicken or something like that, the picture shown with the news story would be of the culprit, so to speak, the chicken, not the life-saving medical treatment. So our concern in this project was, okay, if people are quickly scrolling through their news feed, they may associate the negative information with the picture of the flu vaccine rather than the disease itself. Now, the problems facing researchers in 2019 were serious and were growing ever more challenging because of the impact of social media, misinformation, and fractured public health messaging in some countries. Now, as everyone is well aware, in early March 2020, the scale of the public health problem facing the world went from challenging to massive and multidimensional. Now, our initial news media study really just pales in comparison to the new obstacles to vaccine uptake. And as a consequence, this has prompted me to refocus on what I perceive to be the largest obstacle to vaccine uptake in the United States. So I'll begin by giving us a sense of the state of the global pandemic. So this is Google's COVID tracker. And as of just a few days ago, there were over 14 million confirmed cases of coronavirus across the globe. A total of at least 600,000 people have died from coronavirus, and the death tolls grow daily in countries who have completely failed to control the virus, like the United States. The US in particular is now averaging about 60 to 70,000 confirmed cases a day. And as of now, over 140,000 people have died of the coronavirus, and these numbers are only rising. Consistent with the threat of the coronavirus, in polling over the last 4 months, Americans have remained at least somewhat or very concerned about the risk of getting the coronavirus. Now, inspired by the critical need for a vaccine, researchers and governments have fast-tracked antiviral treatments, and over 20 vaccines are now in development worldwide. So several researchers have noted that if we fail to control the virus and we don't have a vaccine, life is just not going to return to normal, at least as we knew it. Now, when we consider these numbers, it is then very striking that Americans appear to be uncertain about receiving a COVID-19 vaccine. So in this poll conducted by the Associated Press and the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago, they found that roughly half of Americans would get a COVID-19 vaccine. In another poll, it was shown that only a quarter of African Americans would get a coronavirus vaccine, even though the pandemic has disproportionately affected them. Now, these trends are not unique to America, though they appear to be exaggerated here. So even in Germany, there remains there are some fears over vaccines which have been linked to the rise of conspiracy theories, but they're not to the extent we see in the United States. So Americans are worried about getting infected, and yet only half of Americans and a quarter of African Americans report being willing to receive a COVID-19 vaccination in the United States. And so I think this brings into focus a seemingly puzzling picture of why this would be. This talk is my attempt to explain this puzzling set of observations and begin to identify the new obstacles facing researchers who are attempting to increase vaccine uptake. It's an attempt to explain what happened and what are the obstacles facing us. So I want to discuss how conspiracies and what I'll call reasonable vaccine skepticism may explain the troubling trends we're witnessing. Now, some news coverage might lead people to be tempted to explain what we're seeing by thinking that now half of Americans are conspiracy theorists due to widespread misinformation. But I think this explanation is improbable because people seem to be selectively skeptical about the COVID-19 vaccine, at least as of now. In general, in fact, 9 in 10 Americans support vaccines. So to get a grip on this, I first want to talk about how medical skepticism more generally might act as a barrier to vaccine uptake, and then I'm going to apply it to the COVID-19 situation. So first I want to walk through an example to demonstrate how conspiracy theories can impact vaccine uptake by screening off evidence. So here we have 2 nodes, a hypothesis and some data. In our example, we'll say the hypothesis is the belief that vaccines are dangerous, and the data is some studies showing vaccines are safe and effective. Now, in a model like this, evidence for the safety of vaccines will decrease the belief vaccines are dangerous. However, things totally change if we add a background theory to this network, like a big pharma conspiracy. This big pharma conspiracy is connected both to the hypothesis and to the data. And first, it implies the truth of the hypothesis, but it also includes the belief that big pharma seeks to fabricate evidence vaccines are safe in order to, say, make money. In essence, what this conspiracy does is sets up expectations about what kinds of evidence people are likely to see. Now, the consequence of this fact is that rather than countering a misconception that vaccines are dangerous, evidence for a safe vaccine actually supports the big pharma conspiracy, because that's exactly what the big pharma conspiracy kind of entailed and said would happen. And this in turn supports the belief vaccines are dangerous, rather than correcting the attitude. Now that kind of process can prevent vaccine uptake. A full-blown big pharma conspiracy is not widely accepted, but the current state of things shows just how reasonable it might be for people to endorse what I'll call government medical skepticism, a kind of reasonable skepticism towards vaccination today. So this theory is very similar to the big pharma conspiracy, but better mirrors real aspects of how high-level public health decisions are being made in America. First, let's consider the data in this model. The data here is hypothetical, but it's very easy to imagine. An effective, purportedly safe vaccine is created quickly. Now, we know most vaccines take years to develop, and right now, many governments are promising a vaccine by the end of the year or soon after. This would be much faster than we've ever created a vaccine. So I want to pause and just let you reflect on this question. Imagine the Trump administration reported they've created a vaccine that's safe and effective in October, and that this vaccine would be available to you at a local licensed medical facility. So the question is, would you choose to receive this vaccine? And in talking to people, there's a lot of skepticism about receiving this kind of vaccine. Why is that? Well, part of the government medical skepticism kind of theory is that vaccines are dangerous when they're not sufficiently vetted, which is true, and that government officials might rush a risky vaccine into production, which is more debatable. Now, the consequence of this is that even if there is evidence for an effective, safe vaccine, that evidence may be screened off by this government medical skepticism background theory. Now, my hypothesis is the situation we're in right now in post-pandemic America roughly resembles this web of beliefs. It's kind of captured by this web of beliefs. The skepticism we see towards vaccines by Americans is the product of a medical skepticism, which has been induced by government malpractice. Now, what is the evidence for this government malpractice? So in a recent article in The Atlantic, they point out that several things the federal government has done is going to give ammunition to vaccine skeptics. So first, the timelines of vaccine development are so fast that it seems like they must be cutting corners to make them. And if the dates are not actually hit, then this is just further going to discourage trust of medical officials because they're giving them false hope. Second, that a former pharma executive was in charge of the White House's new vaccine initiative and had 12 million of vaccine company stock options, though he divested from them. Again, kind of begs for a big pharma conspiracy, a big pharma speculation, and leads to distrust. And third, the CDC has really failed on many fronts and also has simultaneously been undercut by this administration. So as a result, it's really hard for people to know what to believe. Because for instance, they flip-flopped on face masks. There were initial tests that were faulty, and that set us back hugely in testing and tracing. They pursued trials of unproven and ineffective drugs. And even more recently, the administration has blocked any new funding for testing and tracing while simultaneously arguing children should be in schools, regardless of the danger that poses to the children themselves, their parents, their teachers. So what effects will this have on our government medical skepticism theory? And how might it encourage more general conspiratorial thinking? Well, all of these things reasonably could lead one to not trust the government or those in charge of creating a vaccine. The administration has given evidence they cannot handle the pandemic and are in no way worried about the scientific facts. And they've said as much. And this will have serious implications for vaccination uptake, including vaccine skepticism that goes beyond the context of the immediate pandemic. So in sum, I think this pandemic has amplified or will amplify government vaccine skepticism. Now, how exactly would this kind of skepticism impact vaccination decisions? Well, landmark work from Powell, Weissman, and Markman in 2018 provides a fleshed out intuitive theory of vaccination decisions about what factors impact vaccine decisions and intentions. So what I've presented so far is really a toy model, but Powell and colleagues describe, test, and validate a model that has made several predictions which have been borne out about how beliefs are connected, how changing weights in some beliefs will affect other beliefs regarding vaccine intentions. So one thing they found among many of their findings is that medical skepticism doesn't directly relate to vaccine intentions, but it does relate to the belief that vaccines may have toxic additives, which in turn may make them dangerous. Second, they found that one of the best predictors of vaccine intentions was the perceived danger of vaccines, so a very intuitive result. Given the model of Powell and colleagues, if people feel that the government will rush a risky vaccine into use in the population, and simultaneously the government has failed to act according to our best science, we should expect vaccination intentions to be lower than they would otherwise be. So even if people do fear this disease, they might fear that the vaccine poses a bigger risk than the disease itself. This raises several interesting questions about how people will respond to vaccines that are developed in the United States versus other countries. So for example, one question this raises is, will people trust a vaccine from this administration? And how will that interact with political affiliation? We would expect in this highly polarized time it would interact with political affiliation, but the extent of that interaction is unknown. A second question is, would a vaccine developed in some other countries be universally trusted, whereas vaccines developed in, say, the United States or maybe South Korea or China, would those be trusted only by some groups of people? For example, only by Democrats or only by Republicans? A bigger worry I have that's created by this increase in medical skepticism that comes from the government is that it could beget general vaccine or general medical skepticism that extends beyond the case of the pandemic. So we need to develop new ways to think about and address these problems. Now, we're not going to be able to undo all of the damage this pandemic has wrought through social science alone, because many of the problems we're witnessing are directly due to governmental malpractice and thus are kind of structural problems. But we also need to realize what the landscape of the situation is and also understand what are the possible issues that could come up in this post-pandemic world. So in this talk, I've offered an explanation of this seemingly puzzling phenomenon that people fear being infected by the coronavirus, but they also seem to be uncertain or skeptical even of vaccination. And what I think this talk has shown is that there's a new obstacle. What I think is the biggest obstacle to increasing vaccine uptake is just overall increased skepticism about the safety of government-backed vaccination programs because of how the pandemic has been handled. And I hope this work offers directions for future research to address these important multidimensional problems. I want to thank my collaborators for their feedback on this talk and their inspiration in their work. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.